So what we'll start with today is I'm just going to give you all a little bit of an intro on Tamarie, who we're very lucky to have here today. In preparing for this presentation, I got to meet her, and Bethany described her to me as sunshine, not like sunshine, but is sunshine. And I can attest that this is very accurate. So we're just so grateful. If we could just sit here and like have memory time, that would probably be as valuable as the presentation that you put together, which is also wonderful. So happy to have you here today. For those who don't know Tamarie yet, she is currently a faculty member at the University of Washington School of Social Work. She was recently in the federal government at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, um, in the Society for Research and Child Development and American Association for the Advancement of Science Public Policy. So she was a fellow there after she left the CBHJ, where she was a manager for the reentry initiatives here. So her research focuses on public policy, child welfare, criminal justice systems, children of incarcerated parents. And so I'm just really excited this morning or this afternoon to hear about how her work has been impacted by federal government decisions and spending, because I think she has a really unique perspective on all of that and just kind of will be able to bring it home into like how this actually impacts our work in a very direct way. So really looking forward to hearing more about your work today. Do you want to add anything to that before we dive in?
Absolutely not. I think people know I hate talking about myself, so I'm happy you did it. Uh, no, I was happy to be here and happy to see my old friends and colleagues, so it's great.
Oh, and just ground rules. I forgot to say this at the beginning. You can feel free to have your camera on or off at your preference. Feel free to eat your lunch. We will be having a discussion about halfway through where we'll break out into breakout rooms, but we'll start with Tamarie's presentation, which I will share now.
Yeah, so everyone, thanks for joining us today. So today's talk is, on civics very broadly and kind of talking specifically about how the federal government appropriate funds. And so we're going to start off with like a very brief introduction, which, we just did. And then the main content we're going to go into next is going to be around kind of just an overview of the three branches of government and their individual structure and roles and kind of what they do. Then we're going to talk about system of checks and balances, and then kind of head into then how Congress appropriates money. Then we're going to have a group activity for about 20 minutes or so, kind of giving you the power of Congress and the federal government to appropriate money, how you think it should be appropriated based on your personal values. And then we're going to move into towards the very end of the presentation, just like a case study of my own personal research of how researchers like all of us on this call today can kind of utilize their findings to impact public policy and then kind of discuss the funding mechanism for which that public policy is then funded and trickle down to us at the state level to kind of create great programming for those involved in the criminal legal system. Next slide, please. And so, yeah, the very first slide is just, the US government is structured with three branches of government, of course, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. The legislative branch, also known as Congress, makes the laws. The executive branch enforces the law, and it's headed by the president. The judicial branch interprets the law, and this is the Supreme Court. The three branches were established when the Constitution was adopted in 1787, and this separation of powers was intended in air quotes, intended to prevent any one branch from becoming too powerful. Interestingly enough, when you take a look at how state governments are also structured, it looks very similar to how the federal government is structured, but we can talk more about that in a few seconds. Next slide, please. And so I want to kind of go a little deeper into each branch and kind of what they do and how they're structured. So the very first is the legislature, which is composed of two chambers, the Senate and the House of Representatives, and together they're kind of called Congress. Each state has two senators, no matter the population count, but the proportional representation of representative is based on the population of that particular state. So some states have a lot more representative in the House of Reps than other states do, and it's just correlating to the size of each of the states. But either way, the representative within the House doesn't pass a total of 435 voting members at any time. And so the function of the legislative branch is to create laws, to pass laws, they declare war, and they control the budget. So they hold the purse of the country, essentially. Or to put it in modern language, they have a bunch of like credit cards with really high APRs, right? And so Congress drafts, debates, and passes legislations through a very complicated series of committee meetings. I'm going to get to that a little bit later. The Congress also confirms presidential nominations. They approve the national budget. They ensure that the government has the necessary funds to conduct and function as a country, right? Congress has the power, like I said earlier, to declare war, which is the key aspect in the role of national defense. And it also has the power related to taxes, commerce, and naturalization processes or immigration. The other branch, the executive branch, is responsible for enforcing and implementing laws passed by Congress. It's, of course, led by the president, who serves as the head of state and the government. And it includes people like the vice president, his cabinet, a bunch of other executive departments, independent agencies and various boards, commissions, and committees. The president has the authority to issue executive orders. I think we all know way too much about those now, negotiate international treaties, and appoint federal judges and other officials. So the cabinet is composed of about 15 heads of departments, and these are the heads of departments like Health and Human Services, Department of Justice, and Department of Education, who advises the president and help him manage the federal government on a day-to-day operation, right? Additionally, the executive branch oversees the management of federal agencies and ensures that the coordination of their activities to effectively carry out laws and policies at the federal level. And during my time in the executive branch at Health and Human Services, that branch also oversees how policies at the federal level are interpreted and enacted at the state and local levels. Then the last branch is a judicial branch, which is responsible for interpreting the laws. They determine whether things are constitutional or not, and they apply laws based on individual cases. It is consistent of the Supreme Court to also play in part with other lower federal courts at the state level. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So this includes like district courts and courts of appeals. So typically cases don't get to the Supreme Court unless it goes through the process at the state level first, and then it's bumped up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is the highest level in the land and has a final say on any issues that affect every life of the American people, such as civil rights, religious freedom, and voting rights. The judges in the federal courts are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, and they serve lifetime appointments unless they are impeached or removed by Congress. And I get more into this when I talk about checks and balances on each of these offices. And, they play a crucial role in maintaining rule of law and ensuring, I should say, they should play a crucial role in maintaining the rule of law and ensuring that laws are applied fairly, consistently across the country. And so at the state level, interestingly enough, we kind of see this mirror itself. So the similar structure we see at the federal level is kind of the same structure we see at the state level and how state governments are operating. And so at the state level, for example, in Michigan, the executive branch will be consist of the governor, who heads the executive branch and is responsible for enforcing state laws and overseeing state agencies. And other key officials at this level could be lieutenant governor, attorney general, or secretary of state, for example. And so at the state level, the legislative branch is like the state legislature. So they're the ones who are making state laws and also consists of a Senate and a House of Reps. And they're the ones responsible for enacting state laws, approving state budgets, among many other things. And they also have the power to impeach or remove state officials within the executive branch. And then the judicial branch, we talk about how the state courts play a part with what's happening at the Supreme Court level at the higher branch. And so state courts also interpret state laws and resolve disputes. And state Supreme Courts are the highest court within each state, and they hear appeals at the lower courts. So should a case get appealed at the state Supreme Court, and the outcome is not favorable to the parties involved, that can then be bumped up to the Supreme Court. But sometimes the Supreme Court will also bump it back down to the state level and say, we agree with what your state has decided, let's go with that ruling. So we kind of see similarities in how states are structured in the government structure with how the federal government is actually structured as well. Next slide, please. So the series of checks and balances. I mentioned earlier that, the Constitution and the forefathers in their genius at times, decided that they didn't want to have, one party or one branch have too much power. And so there are a series of interplay among each of the branches that they check and balance each other to ensure that no one has too much power, right? And so, for example, let's start with the executive branch and the president, right? And so here are some of the powers that the executive branch can have or check on the legislative branch, for example. And so veto power. The president can veto any laws passed by Congress, right? The president can also propose new laws and influence the legislative agenda. This is really important and key because if the president, let's say, is a Democrat and the House and Senate are both Republican, it's much harder to set any a legislative agenda because laws won't get passed, right? It would be a conflict between them passing a law in Congress and the president vetoing that power, right? And then the president also checks Congress because he has to submit the budget for the entire country to Congress for them to approve. And again, Congress, when I get to Congress, I'll talk about their checks on the president. But, pretty much the president has a power to approve or not approve Congress budgets that are passed by Congress. And so the president has checks also on the judicial branch as well. And so the president is the one who appoints and nominates all of federal judges, including those at Supreme Court level. And so, anyone sitting on the bench it has to be appointed by the president. And then the president pardons. And so the president has the power to pardon or reprieve federal offenses. Let's move on to the legislative branch of Congress. Their checks on the president include veto override. So even though the president can veto a bill passed by Congress, Congress can then veto his veto, like an Uno reverse, with 2/3 majority of the vote within the House of Representatives. And so that's a check that Congress has on the president, which again is really important, for voting in general. And so if it's not just important to have your man or person or woman, whomever in office, it's also important to have your persons in Congress as well. And so if you have, certain ideas of what you think the country what law should be passed and how it should be governed, it requires cooperation from both the executive branch and Congress to be hand in hand in how they think about law and how they pass laws, or else it's going to be a fight back and forth with them vetoing each other. And so Congress also controls the federal budget and can refuse to fund any executive action. I think kind of saw examples of this playing out lately where the current president has, particularly the executive branch, has attempted to stop lots of funding that has, funding for a lot of executive branch offices and agencies, but we kind of see them going to court and kind of having injunctions against the president's decisions because once the Congress approves funding and spending for a particular agency, that has to continue, and the president cannot stop that. So we kind of see a lot of these things kind of playing out in real life here. And Congress also can impeach. So the House of Representatives can impeach a president, and the Senate can conduct a trial to remove president from office if found guilty. Again, we saw this several years ago with this current president in his first term, where I think he had several impeachments that passed the House of Representatives, but did not pass Senate, so he was able to stay within his office and finish out his term. And appointment confirmation. The Senate confirms the president's nomination for federal judges, cabinet members, and other high-ranking officials. So while the president has the power to appoint and say, I would like, so-and-so to be in this position, Congress can then say, particularly Senate, we don't want that person, and with their vote, decline their appointment, which is, I think, why we see so many of the current administration's, cabinet members being appointed, is because there is an alignment with who is majority within the House and the Senate, and who is also in the White House. So if there's an alignment with, who is majority within the House and Senate and who's in the White House, then typically whatever policies they want and whatever appointees they want in that particular office gets pushed through quicker because they have the votes necessary to push those through in that branch. And then checks on the judicial branch from Congress. So Congress can impeach and remove federal judges for high crimes and misdemeanor, and Congress can propose amendments to the Constitution and can effectively overturn Supreme Court decisions if they are ratified by 3/4 of the states. So I know it seems right now that the Supreme Court seems to be the most powerful of these entities, and kind of whatever they say go. But there are ways to overturn rulings by the Supreme Court, should the country and should the Congress, be so inclined to do so. But again, that requires an alignment of who's in the White House, who's in Congress, and whether or not those values align across the board. For the judicial branch, we kind of see that it does have checks on the president as well. So the judicial branch, the Supreme Court can rule laws unconstitutional through the power of judicial review. I think you've kind of seen a lot of these, particular Roe versus Wade. Now that we have an alignment with Congress and who's in the White House, and also who's on the Supreme Court, they can kind of overturn laws like Roe v. Wade, which previously were law of the land, but because there's an alignment politically and value-wise, in air quotes, of who's in all three of those offices, they can, overturn laws and rule them unconstitutional. But the states have power in this. States have sovereignty, and states can codify some of these laws within their own state and make things legal. I think we've seen that happen, for example, in Michigan and other states. While the Supreme Court rules, abortion to be legal via Roe v. Wade, we saw states like Michigan move quickly to codify that in their state law, making it legal in their state. The Supreme Court also had checks on the executive branch, and so the Supreme Court can invalidate executive actions and executive orders if they're found to be unconstitutional. We saw this happen when Biden was in office, and he passed an executive order to, I think, forgive $20,000 in student loans, but we saw the Supreme Court step up and said that was unconstitutional and overturned that executive order. So we kind of see this current administration passing a bunch of executive orders. Should the Supreme Court be so inclined to step in, they can step in at any time and invalidate those orders. But again, we see an alignment of values across the board, and so that's unlikely to happen. And then impeachment trials. The Supreme Court is the Chief Justice that presides over impeachment trials of the president. So even though the Congress and Senate can, impeach a president, the Supreme Court can also say, you know what, nah, I think he's good. Let's keep him in. So those are some of the checks and balances that we kind of see that, each branch has on each other. Next slide, please. And time is flying. This seems to be like 5 hours long. So the federal budget and the timeline. So Congress appropriates money through detailed multi-stage process that begins with the president's budget proposal. And so this culminates with the passage of appropriation bills. The process starts when the president submits a budget request to Congress, which includes recommendation spending levels at various federal government agencies. This proposal is developed by OMB and is based on input from federal agencies. So federal agencies submit to the president what they feel are their priorities for spending that year or for the next fiscal year, and what programs they want to fund. And the president then kind of looks over and said, this is right. Again, if there's an alignment between the executive branch, then typically, those submissions from federal offices will kind of get their way. Once the president submits the budget, it heads to the Senate Budget Committee, who holds hearings and creates their own budget resolutions, which sets an overall spending limit for allocating funds among the government. These resolutions are not law yet, but they provide frameworks for the appropriations process. The process of appropriation involves a bunch of subcommittees, both in the House and the Senate. Each are responsible for different areas of the government spending, such as defense, education, and health. We kind of have more talk about that when we do our breakout groups. These subcommittees draft and debate appropriations bills. They specify how much money each federal agencies will be given and what programs will receive funding. These bills are then passed in both chambers, so both in the Senate and in the House of Representatives, and then sent to the president for his signature or his veto. Again, alignment with the executive branch and the legislature equals easy a congressional budget passing, misalignment with the president or the executive branch and Congress back and forth on what issues take priority in spending. And again, those are all driven by the values of both parties, right? Next slide. And so it's important to kind of mention here, that on average, so how does the federal spending relates to state? So on average, about 34% of all state budgets come from the federal government. That means that within like an individual state, and this varies, some have much higher, some have much lower. For example, I think like Louisiana is about 37% of their state budget is depending upon federal funds. And so it's also worth noting that typically that red states are more dependent on federal dollars than blue states. And also the federal government distributes funds to the states primarily through grants, which are then allocated and given to state government specific purposes like healthcare, education, infrastructure, and social services. These grants can either be directly given to the states or passed through their local governments, depending on the program which is being funded. This distribution is often based on formulas considering factors like population size, poverty levels, and the needs of states. And so some of the key examples of grants that by which the federal government appropriates monies to the states can include categorical grants, which funds are allocated for specific purposes with strict guidelines on how they're spent. So the federal government said, I want you to spend this money specifically on this particular program and nothing else. They can't be touched. The other examples of block grants, which are more common, and block grants provide more flexibility for the state to decide how to spend funds within a broader category. And so, for example, some block grants can be like the Community Development Block Grant, so the CDBG block grant, which provides funding for community development, like housing, infrastructure, and economic development. Also TANF. TANF is also a block grant, and I think we all know that TANF provides provides assistance for low-income families to achieve some level of self-sufficiency. Also, law enforcement block grants. This is also, I think people probably really don't know this. So block grants for law enforcement, and these support local law enforcement efforts. This include hiring police officers, purchasing equipment, things like that. We kind of saw this expand with the Clinton administration, and who's kind of being blamed for the militarization of the police force we see across America now. That was done because of a block grant from Clinton when he passed that crime bill back in the 90s. And then we also kind of see things that are like doing really good work, like low-income energy assistance, right? So some of these block grants provide financial assistance for low-income families and households to help them pay their energy bills. So this is like a really quick overview, and I was right on time with how the federal government, the structure of it, how it appropriates money, and then how that money trickles down to the states, and how it matches with grants. So I think the next slide is going to be about like breaking out in groups and giving us some time to kind of really talk amongst ourselves and decide if we had the power of the purse, how would we utilize $5 trillion as a federal budget, and how will we appropriate some of these dollars to best, serve the country? Megan, can you?
Yes, so we have 20 minutes budgeted for this. Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm pulling up the actual spending slide just because we didn't get much of a chance to look at this together, and maybe we can just have it up as we talk about how that went. Does anyone want to share any interesting insights from their group discussion?
I'm going to throw Devon in here real quick. You mentioned about science. You want to talk about that for 2 seconds, Devon?
Yeah. So I was mentioning in our group that I found that top three, at least for me, was science and technology. I find that that's one of like the catalysts for like improved change and like just something that is really like a big initiative for like a lot of people who are looking to like making a big impact, especially in as it relates to like medicine, as we know, and then just technology in terms of like just like systems and things that help to like function like our basic like technological needs, especially as we're moving away from like a society that is doing less as it relates to technology, and we're taking more of like the backseat and letting AI kind of like lead. So I think science and technology, at least for me, is like a part of the big three. And I think as far as like budgetary spending, I think that should also like reflect that as well.
Devon. I'm just going to call out the fact that two of our high priorities from our group were transportation and education, and those are like the two smallest amounts in terms of the percent of the actual spending. We didn't get a chance to do that comparison.
I think from the group I was in, I'm similarly. Alex, do you want to tap you to share for a second what you were sharing at the end?
Yeah. So for me, I talked a lot about how funding for one department addressing specific issues that another department technically should, and believing that there should be cost benefit analysis done every so often to figure out whether or not this is working for people and or whether we should put funding into another department to do it. Specifically, thinking about law enforcement and the legal system, a lot of what they respond to is health related. So let's look at the health budget. Let's put more money there. But yeah, just trying to have a smarter idea about how funding is, where funding is placed.
Yeah, that's awesome, Alex. Thank you for bringing that up, because there's also an example of this I learned about recently about how there's this program called In Lieu of Services that's being offered through Medicare, where basically participants in Medicare and Medicaid can apply and receive basically delivered meals. So they're getting food assistance through Medicare because the food assistance program isn't working. So it's interesting, isn't it? Thank you all for awesome discussion. We had a really great discussion in our group too, but I want to make sure we have time for Tamarie to share the rest of her presentation. So let me pull that back up. Does everyone see that?
Yes. Thanks, Megan.
Yeah, so thank you. That I think, yeah, that was a really good conversation. And it's always interesting to kind of see how our own personal values kind of drive what we think, should be prioritized and not. And that's the same for, those who are in these public offices and who in these public offices and kind of controls the country. And so, again, pushing voting, if you want to see your priorities prioritized, then kind of make sure you're putting people in office whose values align with your own personal values. And also think beyond yourself, think about the greater good of others who, are also impacted by things that are passed by those in power. And so, yeah, so quickly, I want to give like a quick overview of my own work and talk about how researchers like all of us on this call can get involved in the policy game and secure a bag, if you will, by leveraging their research findings to create streams of funding, to improve the lives of those who are most marginalized in our country. And for me personally, those are, children who are caught in the child welfare system and parents who are within the criminal legal system and parents who are in the juvenile justice system as well. Next slide, please. It's kind of about my own personal trajectory. I'm from Michigan, Wayne State alum through and through. And, a lot of my initial research and practice was in the child welfare field when I first got started. I had practice with students who were, coming in from the foster care system at Wayne State in their undergrad, and had child welfare involvement in some way, shape, or form. And I was realizing that a lot of those youth who were coming into our program, that themselves had some juvenile justice involvement in some way, shape, or form. So they kind of had the overlap of the juvenile justice system and child welfare involvement at the same time. And some of them who are now adults were kind of getting themselves caught up in situations where that were putting them in contact with the adult criminal legal system. And then I started my criminal justice work at the Center for Behavioral Health and Justice with Dr. Erin Cole-Martin. This was before the center was a center, and it was just a diversion initiative. And the research team was myself, Erin, and Lester Kern, who is now in Chicago finishing his dissertation. And then of course it has done such great work and has grown into many different initiatives. And I started working as a coordinator and the reentry side, and then eventually managing the reentry initiative for a couple of years. I started realizing when I was doing site visits with my partners in Monroe County and some of the counties we're working with in the jails there and also the prisons, I was kind of starting to realize that a lot of the people who were incarcerated that we're working with, my site visits and kind of meeting them in the facilities, a lot of these individuals themselves, either had prior foster care involvement when they were younger, or had children who were currently in the foster care system, or had some foster care involvement as a result of their incarceration. And so as a way to kind of tie together my research, I kind of thought about, the overlap of these two systems and kind of looking at what that meant for populations caught in both of these systems. And so my work looked at two aspects of it. One was a clinical aspect, look at the outcomes of children, their educational, social, behavioral outcomes. And then the other part, which I'm focusing on for this presentation, was public policy. I want to kind of look at public policy and how policy played a role in kind of worsening the outcomes of both these populations. And next slide, please. And this is some of the findings that came out from my dissertation work, right? And so I looked at public policies that were enacted to encourage or maintain contact with parents, for parents who are incarcerated, who have children on the outside, right? And what I found from my work and kind of looking at state level policies across all 50 states was that I found that 26 states explicitly list criminal conviction or incarceration as ground for terminating parental rights. 27 states total out of the 50 states in the country enacted 62 policies total specific to protecting the rights of incarcerated parents and providing exceptions to ASFA, which is the Adoptions and Safe Families Act. And so the Adoptions and Safe Families Act, again, was passed by the Clintons back in the 90s, and it was a pivotal child welfare legislation that was the first to really push permanency, and the impact that that particular policy had on parents who were incarcerated, particularly parents who were in prisons or jail at the time, was that it implemented this 15 out of 22 month rules, which means that if a child was in care 15 out of the most recent 22 months, that their parents could automatically lose their parental rights. And I think we know typically parents who are incarcerated, people who are incarcerated tend to have, I think, a much longer sentencing stint. So what we found was parents who were incarcerated were losing their parental rights at a much faster and a much more frequent rate than parents who actually sexually or physically molested their children. And so that's a no-no. And that's kind of how that's an example of how a child welfare policy in one system had adverse implications for parents or people in a whole different system that wasn't really thought about all the way through. And then we kind of saw that there were 23 states that enacted statutes for potential reinstatement of parental rights. And on the parent side, my research showed that parents who were incarcerated tend to report the loss of their parental rights as the most important barrier for them in contacting their children. Next slide, please. So kind of thinking about, what this meant, and, these two siloed systems, criminal justice system, the child welfare system, not talking to each other, I had an idea for, I think, a really good federal policy. And at the time I had a colleague who was in DC as a congressional staffer, placed in Congressman Dan Davis's office. And she was a child welfare researcher herself. And so I drafted this bill based on the findings of my dissertation research. And it was supposed to be on the floor floor in Congress 2019. But of course, COVID hit 2020 and everything was postponed. And so it kind of had to be pushed and was pushed for several years with kind of nothing happening. And then I finished off my dissertation, I graduated and started my internship or my fellowship in Congress. Next slide, please. And so what ended up happening was because I had this bill that was already drafted, right? It became part of what's called an omnibus bill, right? An omnibus bill generally covers a diverse range of topics. And because a single bill is hard to pass by itself because it requires typically collaboration from both sides of the House, an omnibus bill's kind of like put together a bunch of different bills under the same umbrella, of course, can be passed with one congressional vote instead of like a series of congressional votes, right? And so the omnibus bill that my bill was packaged under was Title 4B of the Social Security Act, which is a critical, child welfare law and pretty much funds all of the federal grant programs supporting child welfare work and research and programs at the state level. And so because this bill focused on children who was in child welfare, I was able to kind of sneak in or get through addressing the issues affecting incarcerated parents as well with this particular bill. Next slide, please. And so the omnibus bill package, it was speedy very quickly. I had another congressional briefing in DC 2023. The package was put together and submitted to the House floor July of 2024, got to committee, Ways and Means, and it passed. It passed the committee and it passed the committee and it passed the House in September of that year with 405 affirmative votes, which means that the majority, about 90% of Congress on both sides, bipartisan bill through and through, voted to pass this bill. From the House, it then went to the Senate Finance Committee. It passed the committee with the unanimous consent. Then it went on to the congressional Senate floor. It also passed the Senate with 100% votes from all the senators saying, yes, let's pass it. It's good. Then it was sent to the president after Christmas and signed into law right before he left office. Thank you, Lord. And so now it's public law and it's now the law of the land. At least for the next, I think, 7 years until they reappropriate the Social Security Act. Next slide, please. And so what does this bill actually say? So the omnibus bill, I think, consisted of about, 10 other different bills that's under the child welfare umbrella. I think my personal portion of it, the one that I wrote, the section that I wrote, the bill that I wrote is specific to improving the partnership relation between parents who are incarcerated and children in foster care. I think it's the first bill that really addresses this at the federal level, which I'm really, really proud of. And it also will provide $35 million in federal grant funding over the next 5 years at the state level for programs to be developed to kind of improve the relationships that parents who are incarcerated are having with their children, both in the communities and those who have foster care experience. I think it's the first of its kind. It's really, really great. And what it does, it really forces both systems to come together at the table. Because what my research showed was that there were some state level actions that were passed that were specific to the child welfare system. There were some that were passed that were specific to the criminal legal system, but it didn't really force cross-system collaboration, which I think is really important. And the way I drafted it was that it forced all parties to come together at the table and draft and create programs that are in the best interest of not just the children, not just the parents, but in the best interest of both parties. Next slide, please. Yeah, and so where this is now appropriations wise, we're talking about overall, how does, the federal government appropriates money to the states, and as researchers, what does that look like for us, right? And so with this particular bill, with any kind of federal bill that passes that has any money attached to it in Congress, right, where it's at right now is once the president signs it into law, it then has to go through appropriations in Congress. So right now, that whole entire package of bills, or any package of bills that has money attached to it, is now being appropriated by Congress. So it's in all of the committees in Congress kind of deciding whether or not should they get this much money, should they not get this much money, whether or not it's a priority for the President of the United States. Is that on his priority list, right? Whether or not it was a bipartisan effort, right? If it was hard to pass and it wasn't bipartisan, then this is the way, then this is an area where, let's say Congress, if Congress is in conflict with the executive branch, they can slash that from the budget, right? But fortunately, this bill was passed bipartisan with full bipartisan support. So I have a good inclination that it's going to pass appropriations and then be appropriated. Once it's appropriated, what does that mean? It's appropriated then, and Congress decides which federal office gets to oversee the dispersion of these funds. Most likely, because it has to do with child welfare and children and families and parents, it'll most likely go to Health and Human Services and potentially the Children's Bureau. The Children's Bureau will then kind of put out notice of funding saying, hey, states, hey, researchers, we have this new grant opportunity. It's for $35 million for 5 to 7 grantees. Submit applications for grant funding over the next year, and we can decide whether or not your program, your project, your intervention, whatever you want to do with this money is good enough for us to allocate money to you to use. And so we have like 1 minute left. I don't have a lot of time, but so it goes through that process. It's then funded. You guys know it's CBHJ because I think this is funded by grant funding. Some of your projects are. And so you know how the grant cycle goes and so on and so forth. But yeah, this is, I think, next slide. I think this is where it ends. And no, we are not ending. We have 1 slide left. And so this is really important because I know, my life's work, I care a great deal about the incarcerated population. I care a great deal about children, and I care a great deal about families, and any kind of program or funding that can provide, services for families to keep them together, because you were incarcerated doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't make you a bad parent, and it doesn't make you a bad human being. And children deserve their parents and deserve their families. And so that was my impetus for, drafting this, and hopefully we see some really good grants come from this and really good programs. And if the research is really good from this, then perhaps states can absorb the programs into their existing budgets, and it can, be longstanding. Next slide. This is it. I think I'm done. I'm done. You can screenshot, and if you want to talk more, you can always email me. Really great headshot. I don't look that great in person, but I'm joking. But yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's really great talking to you all and former friends and colleagues, and it's good. Any questions? Doorknob questions with the seconds we have left?
Thank you so much, Tamarie. Do you have a few minutes that you could stay on for any who have the time?
I do.
Just wanted to offer that. So if anyone has any questions that they want to ask live, please chime in. Let me check the chat. Lots of thank yous. Okay, well, I'm going to send out the survey for this event to all the staff. So I'm going to put that in our Teams chat just because it'll be easier to grab later. There is a box in there where you could just put in anything that you still want to know about this topic. So if you have any questions that come to you now or later, we'll make sure we get answers to those. But yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And thank you so much, Tamarie. That was an amazing presentation, very inspiring. And particularly thank you for that last slide, because it gave me all the warm and fuzzy feelings after listening to a talk about congressional spending. It was a really good place to end. So thank you for bringing us back to the why behind everything.
Exactly. Yeah, it's always a why.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. It's such a pleasure. Make sure if you miss Tamarie, reach out, keep in touch, and we'll talk to you all later. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.